Sometimes the smallest delay reveals the biggest truth. No one inside Carter and Row Steakhouse understood why one of the richest men in America had suddenly dropped to one knee, his shoulders shaking as tears filled his eyes. The lunchtime conversation stopped. Crystal glasses rested untouched. Forks hovered above expensive plates. Even the piano player missed a note. Ethan Carter, the billionaire whose name appeared on magazine covers and business channels almost every week, stared at the young waitress standing quietly in front of him. She no longer wore the restaurant's black apron. It had already been folded and placed neatly on the hostess stand beside a small paper envelope containing her final paycheck. Her white blouse was still perfectly pressed despite the difficult morning, and her blonde hair remained tied into the same simple ponytail she had worn every day for the past 3 years. Claire Bennett looked exhausted, but there was something unusual about her expression. She wasn't angry. She wasn't begging. She wasn't trying to defend herself. She simply stood there with calm blue eyes that carried a quiet dignity no expensive suit could ever buy. Around them, customers whispered to one another, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Only minutes earlier, they had watched the restaurant manager dismiss Claire in front of everyone for arriving exactly 5 minutes late. Company policy, he had announced loudly enough for half the dining room to hear. Late is late. Rules exist for everyone. Claire had listened without interrupting. She had thanked him for the opportunity, untied her apron with steady hands, and apologized to her co-workers for the extra workload before preparing to leave forever. She never once explained herself. She never once asked for another chance. Now the same billionaire who had quietly observed the entire scene from his corner table looked as though the weight of the world had settled onto his shoulders. His expensive watch reflected the afternoon sunlight pouring through the tall front windows, but he seemed completely unaware of the room around him. His eyes remained fixed on Claire as though she represented something he had spent years searching for without realizing it. The manager cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Carter, if there's a problem, I assure you we handled the situation according to company standards." Ethan slowly lifted his head, and for the first time that afternoon, everyone noticed the tears on his face. His voice, usually calm enough to negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions without raising a single word, barely escaped his lips. "You fired the wrong person." Silence spread across the restaurant like the first snowfall of winter. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Claire looked almost confused by his reaction. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her departure, much less one of the country's most influential businessmen. She offered him a gentle smile that carried neither resentment nor self-pity. "It's all right, Mr. Carter," she said softly. They were only following the rules. Those simple words struck Ethan harder than any boardroom confrontation he had ever faced. Following the rules. He repeated the phrase silently while remembering the phone call he had received less than 15 minutes earlier. A phone call that had revealed where Claire Bennett had been exactly 5 minutes before she walked through these restaurant doors. A phone call that changed everything he believed he knew about responsibility, success, and what true character actually looked like. The manager reached for Claire's envelope, clearly hoping to end the uncomfortable moment before the customers began recording videos on their phones. But Ethan stepped forward and carefully picked up the folded apron instead. He held it with surprising respect, almost as though it were something priceless. His hands trembled. Claire noticed, but she still didn't ask why. She simply waited, patient as ever, unaware that within the next few moments every life inside that restaurant, especially Ethan Carter's, was about to change forever. 24 hours earlier, long before the silent dining room and the tears that no one could explain, Claire Bennett began her morning the same way she had nearly every weekday for the past 3 years. At 5:30 in the morning, the small alarm clock on her nightstand chimed softly inside her modest one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Hartford. She reached over before the second tone, switched it off, and sat quietly for a moment while the first pale light slipped through the curtains. There was nothing luxurious about her home. The kitchen table had been repaired twice. The coffee maker had a cracked handle held together with clear tape. Her shoes by the front door had been polished so many times that the leather no longer reflected light. Yet everything was clean, carefully organized, and filled with the quiet discipline of someone who respected what little she had. Claire wrapped a light gray sweater around her shoulders and opened the apartment window just enough to let the cool spring air drift inside. She smiled as birds gathered on the telephone wires outside. Before checking her phone or making breakfast, she filled a small watering can and carefully watered the row of herbs growing along her kitchen window. Fresh basil, rosemary, and mint. They reminded her that small things flourished when someone remembered them every single day. Her phone buzzed with a message from her elderly neighbor across the hall. "Good morning, Claire. My arthritis is acting up again. Would you mind bringing my groceries upstairs later if you have time?" Claire smiled before typing her answer. "Of course, Mrs. Wilson. I will stop by after work. Have a wonderful morning until then." She never considered kindness an interruption. To her, it was simply another part of the day, no different from brushing her hair or tying her shoes. She brewed inexpensive coffee, packed a turkey sandwich she had made the night before, and slipped a folded envelope into her purse. Inside was half of her weekly paycheck. Every Friday, she mailed part of her earnings to help support the community center where she had once attended after school as a child. Almost no one knew she did it. She preferred it that way. As she walked toward the bus stop, familiar faces greeted her along the neighborhood sidewalk. The crossing guard waved. A mail carrier tipped his cap. A little girl riding a pink bicycle shouted good morning before wobbling around the corner. Claire greeted every one of them by name. She believed people deserved to feel noticed, especially when the rest of the world seemed too busy to look up. 40 minutes later, she stepped off the city bus 2 blocks from Carter and Rose Steakhouse. The restaurant had not opened yet, but she always arrived early enough to polish glasses, help the kitchen prepare silverware, and check on the newest servers before customers arrived. She never considered those extra minutes part of her job description. She simply wanted the day to begin a little easier for everyone else. Inside the employee entrance, the morning crew was already bustling around the kitchen. Steam drifted upward from simmering soup. Fresh bread filled the air with warmth. One of the younger servers struggled to balance a tray of coffee cups while reviewing the lunch reservation list. Claire gently took half the cups without saying a word, smiling as they reached the service station together. "You always know when someone needs help," the young server laughed. Claire shrugged softly. Sometimes people ask with words. Sometimes they ask with their eyes. Those who worked beside her admired her, although few understood her completely. She never joined workplace gossip. She never complained about difficult customers. She quietly traded shifts whenever someone needed to attend a family event or care for a sick child. More than once she had stayed hours after closing to help clean the dining room, even when she was not scheduled. When thanked, she always answered the same way. "We all have hard days. Today it is your turn. Tomorrow it could be mine." None of them realized how true those words would become before the afternoon was over. By 11:30, the restaurant had transformed into the polished world its wealthy guests expected. Sunlight poured through towering windows, reflecting across crystal glasses and dark walnut tables. Every chair stood perfectly aligned. Every napkin had been folded with careful precision. Claire moved through the dining room with the effortless confidence that only came from years of quiet experience. She greeted each guest with the same warm smile, whether they ordered a simple bowl of soup or the most expensive steak on the menu. To Claire, respect was never measured by the size of a bill. Across town, Ethan Carter closed the final folder on the conference table inside Carter Global Headquarters. The board meeting had lasted nearly 3 hours, yet no one in the room appeared more energized than he was. At 39 years old, Ethan had built one of the nation's largest investment firms through relentless discipline and impossible standards. Newspapers often described him as brilliant. Employees usually described him as demanding. Ethan himself preferred one word: consistent. He believed every meaningful achievement came from keeping promises, respecting schedules, and never allowing emotions to interfere with responsibility. His late father had repeated one lesson throughout his childhood: 5 minutes late becomes 50 minutes tomorrow. Ethan had never forgotten those words. His executive assistant entered quietly carrying a leather portfolio. "Your lunch reservation is in 20 minutes, Mr. Carter." Carter and Rowe confirmed your private table. He nodded without looking up. "Excellent. I have another meeting afterward, so we leave in exactly 5 minutes." She smiled politely. She had heard that sentence hundreds of times. Nothing about Ethan Carter's calendar happened by accident. Every hour had a purpose. Every minute had value. As his driver guided the black sedan through downtown Hartford, Ethan reviewed financial reports while city buildings passed beyond the tinted windows. Construction cranes reached toward the bright blue sky. Office workers hurried across sidewalks carrying coffee cups. Cyclists navigated traffic with practiced confidence. Ethan rarely noticed the people outside his window. His attention remained fixed on numbers, projections, and deadlines. Success had taught him how to calculate nearly everything except the hidden stories carried by strangers. The sedan stopped outside Carter and Row Steakhouse precisely at 11:55. Ethan glanced at his watch with quiet satisfaction before stepping onto the sidewalk. The restaurant manager, Richard Collins, hurried toward the entrance with the polished smile reserved for influential guests. "Welcome back, Mr. Carter. Your table is ready." Ethan offered a courteous nod as they walked inside. He appreciated restaurants that operated efficiently. The polished floors gleamed. Servers moved with discipline. The atmosphere reflected order, something he valued almost as much as honesty. As Richard escorted him toward the private dining area, Ethan noticed an unfamiliar tension spreading across the staff. Several employees exchanged nervous glances toward the employee entrance. One young hostess looked repeatedly at the wall clock before biting her lip. Ethan frowned slightly, but continued walking. Restaurants experience staffing issues all the time. It was hardly his concern. Richard sighed quietly, as if speaking more to himself than to his guest. "One of our servers is running late today. Very unusual for her." Ethan stopped for the briefest moment before continuing forward. "Running late is a choice," he replied calmly. Richard nodded in agreement. "Exactly my thinking, sir. Standards disappear one exception at a time." Ethan said nothing else. The statement matched the principles that had guided his entire career. He settled into his chair beside the large front window overlooking the entrance, ordered sparkling water, and opened his tablet to review documents before lunch arrived. Outside, the city continued moving with ordinary rhythm. Inside, the second hand on the dining room clock crept closer to noon. Neither Ethan nor anyone else in the restaurant realized that only a few blocks away Claire Bennett was facing a decision that no schedule, no company handbook, and no executive policy could ever fully measure. Claire checked the time on the simple silver watch her mother had given her years ago. 11:49. She smiled to herself. Plenty of time. The restaurant was only a 7-minute walk away, and she knew every traffic light between the bus stop and Carter and Row Steakhouse. She adjusted the strap of her purse and stepped onto Maple Avenue, enjoying the warm breeze that carried the scent of fresh flowers from the small public park nearby. Office workers hurried past her, each absorbed in a phone call or a meeting. Waiting on the other side of the next intersection, Claire walked at her usual steady pace until an unfamiliar sound interrupted the rhythm of the street. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply the frightened cry of a young child followed by several gasps from nearby pedestrians. Claire turned immediately. A little boy, no older than 7, had fallen from his bicycle near the corner where two neighborhood streets met. His bicycle lay on its side several feet away while a grocery bag had spilled across the sidewalk, scattering apples that slowly rolled toward the curb. The child looked frightened and disoriented, blinking rapidly as he tried to understand what had happened. Several adults slowed down, looked in his direction, then continued walking, assuming someone else would step in. Claire never waited for someone else. She crossed the street without hesitation and knelt beside the boy, keeping her voice calm and gentle. "Hello there. My name is Claire. Can you tell me your name?" The little boy swallowed hard before answering. "Oliver." "Well, Oliver, I think you were very brave," Claire said with a reassuring smile. "Let us stay still for just a moment while we make sure you are feeling all right." She noticed a scrape on his elbow and that one of his shoelaces had come untied, probably causing him to lose control of the bicycle. More importantly, she noticed that he seemed confused and was struggling to answer simple questions. Her expression changed. She reached into her purse, removed a clean handkerchief, and gently helped him sit comfortably on a nearby bench while asking another passerby to call emergency medical services. Within moments, another woman stopped to help, offering a bottle of water. Claire thanked her warmly before continuing to comfort Oliver, speaking about baseball, school, and the golden retriever printed on his backpack. She wanted to keep him relaxed until help arrived. Every few seconds, she glanced toward the approaching ambulance she could already hear in the distance. The paramedics arrived quickly and thanked Claire for remaining with the child. They explained that because Oliver had appeared briefly disoriented, they preferred taking him to the hospital for a full evaluation. Claire nodded with relief. She quietly picked up the scattered groceries, placed them inside the torn bag as neatly as possible, and handed the backpack to one of the paramedics. "His family will probably be worried," she said softly. "Please make sure they know he was very brave." One of the paramedics looked at her name tag pinned to her blouse. "Miss Bennett, we may need someone who witnessed everything to answer a few questions before we leave." Claire looked down at her watch. 11:55. She closed her eyes for the briefest moment. Her shift officially began at noon. Richard Collins had warned the staff more than once that another late arrival would result in immediate termination. She understood exactly what those 5 minutes might cost her. Then she looked back at Oliver, who managed a small, nervous smile from inside the ambulance. Claire smiled right back. Some choices did not need time to make. She climbed into the ambulance for only a few minutes to answer every question carefully and accurately, making certain the medical team understood exactly what she had seen before quietly slipping away toward the restaurant, unaware that the 5 minutes she had willingly surrendered would soon change not only her own future, but also the life of a man she had never expected to meet. Claire thanked the paramedics one last time before stepping out of the ambulance and onto the sidewalk. The vehicle pulled away with its lights flashing softly into the distance while she stood still for a brief moment, watching until it disappeared around the corner. She looked down at her watch. 12:05. Exactly 5 minutes. She released a slow breath, adjusted the strap of her purse, and began walking toward Carter and Rose Steakhouse at the fastest pace that still allowed her to remain composed. She refused to run because she knew rushing through the front door breathless and flustered would help no one. Instead, she focused on arriving with the same professionalism she had carried every other day. As the restaurant came into view, Claire noticed several lunch guests entering through the front entrance. Luxury sedans lined the curb. Valets hurried between arriving vehicles. The dining room beyond the large windows already buzzed with conversation. She quietly entered through the employee door, smoothed her blouse, and tied her black apron around her waist before taking a single step toward the dining room. Richard Collins was already waiting. His expression revealed everything before he spoke. The clipboard in his hand rested firmly against his chest. The wall clock behind him displayed 12:05 with painful precision. Every member of the kitchen staff suddenly became very interested in their own work. No one wanted to witness what they knew was coming. Richard folded his arms. "Claire Bennett, do you know what time your shift began?" Claire met his eyes without lowering hers. "Yes, sir. 12 o'clock. And what time is it now?" 12:05. Richard nodded once. "Then you understand our attendance policy." Claire answered quietly. "Yes, sir. I do." He waited several seconds, expecting an explanation, an excuse, perhaps even an emotional plea. None came. Instead, Claire simply stood calmly with both hands folded in front of her apron. Richard frowned slightly. "Do you have anything you would like to say before I make this official?" Claire thought briefly about Oliver. She pictured the frightened little boy slowly smiling from inside the ambulance. She remembered the relief in the paramedic's voice when she agreed to stay for a few extra minutes. Then she looked back at Richard and gently shook her head. "No, sir." That answer surprised everyone. One of the line cooks quietly looked away. Another server pressed her lips together, wishing Claire would explain what had happened. She knew Claire had never been late before. Not once in 3 years. Richard removed a folded envelope from his clipboard. "Then I have no choice except to terminate your employment effective immediately." Claire accepted the envelope with steady hands. "Thank you for letting me work here." Richard blinked. He had expected disappointment, perhaps even anger. Gratitude had never crossed his mind. "That is all you have to say?" he asked. Claire offered a gentle smile that carried more peace than defeat. "I hope the lunch service goes smoothly today." She untied her apron with careful movements, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the register instead of leaving it carelessly behind. Before walking toward the employee exit, she quietly approached the youngest server, who looked overwhelmed by the crowded dining room. "Table 12 prefers their dressing on the side," Claire whispered kindly. "Table 7 ordered sparkling water before their appetizers yesterday. They may ask for it again. You will do just fine." The young woman fought back tears and nodded. Claire gave her shoulder a reassuring pat before turning away. She did not realize that from his private table near the front window, Ethan Carter had watched every second of the exchange. At first, he saw only another employee who had failed to meet an expectation. Yet something about the young woman lingered in his thoughts. It was not what she said. It was everything she chose not to say. As Claire quietly walked toward the front door carrying nothing more than her purse and her final paycheck, Ethan found himself looking away from the financial reports on his tablet for the first time that afternoon, unable to explain why her silent dignity seemed far more memorable than any business meeting waiting on his calendar. Claire stepped out of Carter and Row Steakhouse into the warm afternoon sunlight without looking back. The glass door closed quietly behind her, separating her from 3 years of early mornings, familiar faces, and routines that had become part of her life. She tightened her grip on the small envelope containing her final paycheck and walked toward the sidewalk with the same steady pace she had carried every morning. She did not feel angry. She felt uncertain, but uncertainty had visited her before. She had learned long ago that dignity often meant continuing forward before the next step became visible. Inside the restaurant, lunch service continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Servers carried polished trays through the dining room. Silverware clinked softly against fine china. Conversations about business mergers, investment portfolios, and vacation homes floated through the air. Yet Ethan Carter found himself reading the same paragraph on his tablet for the 4th time without understanding a single word. His attention kept drifting toward the front entrance where Claire had disappeared only moments earlier. Something about her silence refused to leave his thoughts. Most people fought to protect their reputation. They blamed traffic, weather, family emergencies, or someone else. Claire had offered none of those. She had accepted the consequence without asking for sympathy. Ethan finally looked up at Richard Collins, who was checking reservation notes near the hostess stand. "Has she been late before?" he asked casually. Richard looked surprised by the question. "Never. 3 years. Perfect attendance until today." Ethan slowly placed his tablet on the table. "And you still fired her?" Richard straightened his jacket. "Policies only matter if everyone follows them, Mr. Carter. The moment exceptions begin, discipline disappears." Ethan nodded almost automatically. Normally, he would have agreed without hesitation. Those words sounded remarkably similar to the principles that had guided his own company for decades. Yet they felt strangely incomplete this afternoon. Before he could continue the conversation, his personal phone vibrated across the table. The caller identification displayed his younger sister, Emily. Ethan answered immediately. Emily rarely called during business hours unless something truly mattered. "Ethan," she said, her voice still unsteady. "I finally reached the hospital. Oliver is going to be all right." Ethan sat upright so quickly that the chair shifted against the hardwood floor. "Hospital? What happened?" He fell from his bicycle on Maple Avenue. A wonderful young woman stayed with him until the ambulance arrived. The paramedics said she kept him calm the entire time and answered all of their questions before rushing to work. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, relieved that his 8-year-old nephew was safe. "Did they tell you who she was?" Emily answered softly. "Only that her name was Claire. They said she seemed more worried about getting to her job on time than receiving any thanks." Ethan felt something tighten inside his chest. Claire. The same name echoed through his thoughts with unsettling clarity. He looked toward the front window where Maple Avenue stretched only a few blocks away. His eyes slowly moved to the dining room clock. 12:20. Then to the employee entrance where Claire had appeared exactly 5 minutes late. A quiet realization began assembling itself piece by piece. He remembered Richard saying she had never been late before. He remembered her refusing to explain herself. He remembered the gratitude in her voice after losing the job she clearly valued. "Emily," Ethan asked carefully, "what time did the ambulance leave the scene?" There was a brief pause while she checked with someone beside her. "Just before noon," she replied. The paramedic said the young woman stayed until every question had been answered because she did not want anyone to misunderstand what had happened. Ethan lowered the phone slowly without speaking. Outside the restaurant window, ordinary life continued across the city streets, but inside his carefully ordered world, something invisible had shifted. For the first time in many years, he wondered whether a rule could remain perfectly consistent while still failing to deliver true justice. The phone remained in Ethan Carter's hand long after the call had ended. Around him, the restaurant continued operating with polished efficiency, yet every familiar sound seemed strangely distant. The soft conversations, the quiet footsteps across the hardwood floor, even the gentle notes from the piano blended into a background he no longer heard. His attention was fixed on a single thought. Claire Bennett had not chosen to be late. She had chosen another person's safety over her own certainty. Ethan slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the front entrance where Richard Collins was speaking with the hostess. The manager smiled politely, assuming his distinguished guest needed something for lunch. Instead, Ethan asked only one question. Did Claire tell you why she arrived 5 minutes late? Richard frowned. No, sir. She said nothing. Did you ask? Richard hesitated. I gave her the opportunity to explain. Ethan looked directly into his eyes. Offering someone the opportunity is not the same as wanting to hear the answer. The words settled heavily between them. Richard shifted uncomfortably before replying. Mr. Carter, every employee understands the attendance policy. If I begin making exceptions, the standards disappear. Ethan glanced toward the folded black apron still resting beside the hostess stand. It had been left there with remarkable care, every crease perfectly aligned. Even after losing her job, Claire had shown respect for a workplace that had shown her none. Standards are important, Ethan said quietly. But wisdom is knowing when a rule has already achieved its purpose. Richard remained silent. Ethan walked closer to the hostess stand and picked up the neatly folded apron. It felt surprisingly light in his hands, yet somehow heavier than any contract he had signed that year. He imagined Claire taking the extra few seconds to fold it carefully instead of dropping it onto the counter in frustration. That simple act revealed more about her character than any resume ever could. Before another word could be spoken, Ethan's phone rang again. This time the caller was St. Matthew Medical Center. Mr. Carter, a calm voice said, your sister listed you as Oliver's emergency contact. We simply wanted to let you know that he is resting comfortably and his parents have arrived. Relief washed across Ethan's face. Thank you. May I ask one question? The woman who stayed with him this morning, was her name Claire Bennett? Yes, the nurse answered warmly. She was incredibly kind. She stayed until our team had every detail we needed. She apologized several times because she was worried about being late for work. We actually encouraged her to leave sooner, but she insisted that accuracy mattered because she wanted Oliver to receive the best care possible. Ethan closed his eyes. Accuracy mattered. Responsibility mattered. She had honored both. She had simply placed a frightened child ahead of her own comfort. Did she leave any contact information? He asked. Only her first and last name. She specifically requested that we not contact her employer because she did not want anyone receiving special treatment on her behalf. She said helping someone should never become a reason to expect a reward. Ethan thanked the nurse quietly before ending the call. For several moments he simply stood there, unable to move. Throughout his career, he had met countless people eager to be recognized for even the smallest act of generosity. Claire had done exactly the opposite. She had protected a stranger, accepted the personal cost, and walked away without expecting anyone to know. Ethan slowly looked around the elegant dining room. Expensive watches reflected the afternoon light. Luxury handbags rested beside polished leather chairs. Business leaders negotiated multi-million-dollar opportunities over perfectly prepared meals. Yet the person with the greatest character had already walked out the front door carrying nothing except a final paycheck and the certainty that she had made the right decision. In that quiet realization, something inside Ethan began to change. For the first time in many years, he questioned whether success should be measured only by discipline and results, or whether the greatest measure of a person's worth was the quiet choice they made when no one was watching. Claire had already walked nearly 6 blocks before she finally stopped, not because she was tired, but because the weight of the afternoon had begun settling quietly upon her shoulders. She sat on a weathered wooden bench overlooking the small public park where children laughed beneath tall maple trees. The envelope containing her final paycheck remained unopened inside her purse. Money could wait. She reached for her phone instead and opened the calendar she kept carefully organized every month. Rent was due in 11 days. Mrs. Wilson's groceries still needed to be carried upstairs that evening. The community center donation she mailed every Friday would probably have to be smaller next week. She stared at the screen for only a moment before gently closing it again. Worry would not solve tomorrow. It never had. Back at Carter and Rowe Steakhouse, Ethan Carter stood motionless beside the hostess stand, still holding Claire's neatly folded apron. His executive assistant, Melissa, entered the restaurant after searching for him for nearly 20 minutes. She immediately sensed something was different. Ethan rarely looked unsettled. "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "your 1 o'clock meeting has been waiting for 15 minutes. Should I reschedule?" Ethan looked at his watch, then at the apron in his hands. For the first time in years, he answered with words Melissa never expected to hear. "Yes. Tell them something more important came up." Melissa blinked in surprise, but nodded. She had worked beside Ethan for almost 8 years. Never once had he postponed a board meeting without extraordinary circumstances. As she walked away to make the necessary calls, Ethan turned back toward Richard Collins. "I need Claire Bennett's employee records." Richard hesitated. "Sir, those are confidential." Ethan calmly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a business card on the hostess stand. "My legal team owns 30% of the investment group financing your parent company's expansion next quarter. I am not asking because I am curious. I am asking because someone in this building made a decision without understanding the complete truth." Richard's expression changed instantly. A few minutes later, he returned carrying Claire's personnel file. Ethan opened it slowly. 3 years of employment. Perfect attendance. Outstanding customer reviews. Multiple handwritten compliments from guests. Several internal awards for teamwork. Not a single disciplinary warning. Near the back of the folder, he found something unexpected. A note written by Richard himself nearly 2 years earlier. Claire voluntarily stayed 6 hours after closing during winter power outage to assist elderly customers until transportation arrived safely. No overtime requested. Ethan closed the folder carefully. "You knew exactly who she was," he said softly. Richard lowered his eyes. "She has always been one of our best employees." Then why was there no room for one conversation before ending her career here? Richard searched for an answer, but found only silence. Ethan understood that silence all too well. It sounded remarkably similar to his own certainty only an hour earlier. Without another word, he left the restaurant carrying the folded apron beneath his arm. His driver opened the rear door of the sedan, expecting instructions for downtown headquarters. Instead, Ethan said, "St. Matthew Medical Center." During the drive, he called his sister again. Emily answered immediately. "How is Oliver?" Ethan asked. "He is smiling already," she replied. "He keeps asking whether the nice lady made it to work on time." Ethan looked out the window as city buildings reflected the afternoon sun. His throat tightened. "No," he answered honestly. She did not. Emily grew quiet before speaking again. "The nurse told me something else." Claire refused to let them call her employer because she said every workplace has rules, and she accepted that helping Oliver was her own decision. She did not want anyone feeling obligated to repay her. Ethan closed his eyes. Every new detail seemed to reveal another layer of the same remarkable character. Claire had protected a frightened child. She had protected the medical staff from confusion. She had even protected the employer who had dismissed her only minutes later. She carried compassion the way other people carried wallets or keys. Naturally, quietly, without expecting recognition. The hospital appeared ahead as the sedan turned into the entrance. Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk with Claire's folded apron still resting in his hands. He had come searching for answers, but deep inside he already knew one thing with absolute certainty. Before this day ended, he would find the woman whose kindness had quietly exposed the greatest flaw in the rules he had trusted his entire life. The nurse recognized Claire's name almost immediately. She smiled warmly as Ethan Carter approached the reception desk carrying the carefully folded black apron beneath his arm. "She left about 30 minutes ago," the nurse said. "She only stayed long enough to make sure Oliver's parents had arrived. Then she thanked everyone for taking good care of him and quietly walked away." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. Even now, Claire had disappeared without waiting for gratitude. "Did she leave a phone number?" he asked. The nurse hesitated before nodding. "She gave permission for us to contact her only if Oliver needed additional information later. Under the circumstances, I believe she would understand." Ethan accepted the small card with both hands, treating it with the same respect he would have shown an important business contract. That evening, as the sun settled behind the Hartford skyline, He stood outside Claire's apartment building instead of sending an assistant in his place. Success had taught him to delegate almost everything. Gratitude, he decided, should never be delegated. Claire was returning from Mrs. Wilson's apartment with an empty grocery bag when she noticed the black sedan parked along the curb. Ethan stepped forward, still holding the folded apron. She looked genuinely surprised. "Mr. Carter?" she asked softly. "Is Oliver all right?" Those were the very first words she spoke. Not "Why are you here?" Not "How did you find me?" Only concern for the little boy. Ethan felt the truth settle even deeper inside him. "He is doing well because of you," he replied. Claire smiled with visible relief. "That is wonderful news." Ethan held out the folded apron. "I believe this belongs to you." Claire looked at it for a moment, but did not reach for it. "Not anymore," she answered gently. "It belonged to the restaurant." Ethan shook his head. "No, it belonged to someone who honored it every single day." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. A cool evening breeze stirred the trees lining the sidewalk. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while riding bicycles through the neighborhood. The ordinary sounds of life seemed strangely beautiful. "Why did you not tell your manager what happened?" Ethan finally asked. Claire looked toward the fading sunset before answering. "Because helping Oliver was my decision. My manager had a responsibility to follow the information he had. I did not want him to feel guilty for something he did not know." Ethan struggled to find words. Throughout his career, he had negotiated billion-dollar agreements without hesitation, yet standing before one quiet waitress, language suddenly felt inadequate. "Claire," he said carefully, "I came here intending to offer you a position at one of my companies. It would pay far more than the restaurant ever could." Claire smiled kindly. "That is very generous." "But," Ethan asked. She looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "This afternoon, the nurse mentioned that St. Matthew Medical Center is opening a patient family support department next month. They need someone to help visitors, guide families, and comfort children during difficult days. I submitted an application before coming home." Ethan stared at her for a moment before slowly smiling himself. It was exactly the answer he should have expected. She had chosen purpose over prestige. "Then I sincerely hope they hire you," he said. Claire thanked him, and they shook hands before Ethan returned to his car. 3 months later, Carter and Rose Steakhouse introduced a new policy requiring managers to review emergency circumstances personally before any termination decision could be finalized. Richard Collins often admitted that the lesson had changed the way he viewed leadership forever. St. Matthew Medical Center proudly welcomed Claire Bennett as one of the first members of its patient family support team. Children remembered her smile. Parents remembered her calm voice. Nurses often said the waiting room seemed lighter whenever she was working. Ethan established the 5 Minutes Initiative across every company he owned, guaranteeing that employees facing genuine emergencies would be heard before judgment was ever passed. In his office, inside a simple wooden frame rather than an expensive display case, rested one carefully folded black apron. Visitors sometimes asked why such an ordinary object occupied the most visible place in the room. Ethan always answered the same way. "Because every time I look at it, I remember that character cannot be measured by a time clock. Kindness does not ask for recognition, and the greatest leaders never stop long enough to judge until they have first taken the time to understand."